I didn't think a fence could start a war, but looking back now, that's exactly what it did. Not the kind with shouting in the street or police cars at midnight. No, this one was quieter, slower, the kind that creeps up on you until one day you realize something that was always yours isn't anymore. And the worst part, it almost happened right under my nose. I lived just outside a small town in western Pennsylvania, the kind of place where people still wave when they drive by, where you know your neighbor's dogs before you know their names, and where property lines, well, they're usually more of an understanding than a debate. My place isn't fancy, just a modest house with a detached workshop out back where I spend most of my evenings fixing old tools or pretending I still have the patience to build furniture. For years, the lot next to mine sat empty. It had an old, leaning shed, some overgrown brush, and a few rusted fence posts that probably dated back to before I was born. Nobody touched it. Nobody cared. It was just there. Then one summer, everything changed. A for sale sign went up in early June, and by August, it was gone. A week later, I saw a black pickup roll in, followed by a couple SUVs, and that's when I first met Daniel Mercer. Daniel wasn't what I expected. He was younger than me, maybe late 30s, dressed sharp even on a hot day, the kind of guy who wore sunglasses like he was always being watched. Friendly, though, at least on the surface. "Hey there," he said the first time we met, walking right across the grass like the place already belonged to him. "I'm Daniel. Just closed on this lot." I shook his hand. "Evan. Been next door about 15 years. He smiled, looked around like he was already redesigning the whole place in his head. "I've got some plans. Gonna clean it up, maybe build something nice here." "Good," I said. "It's been sitting long enough." And I meant that. I really did. I wasn't the kind of neighbor who complained about progress. If anything, I figured it'd bring the property values up a bit. Maybe make the area feel less forgotten. I just didn't realize how far his definition of improvement was going to go. Within a week, the trucks started showing up. At first, it was manageable, a couple landscapers clearing brush, hauling away debris, leveling out the ground. Then came the heavier equipment. Excavators, flatbeds stacked with stone, pallets of lumber, steel brackets, you name it. Every morning, I'd wake up to the sound of engines and the steady clank of construction echoing across what used to be a quiet stretch of land. It didn't bother me, not really. I mean, people build things. That's life. Still, there was something about the pace of it all that felt aggressive. Like he wasn't just fixing up the property. He was trying to transform it into something entirely different, something that didn't quite match the rest of the neighborhood. And then, the fence started going up. At first, I thought it was just going to be a standard wooden divider. 6-foot panels, maybe a gate, nothing special. That's what most of us had. Practical, simple, gets the job done. But this was something else. They began by digging deep holes every 10 or 12 feet along what I assumed was the property line. Then they poured concrete and set these massive stone columns, each one perfectly cut, stacked, and sealed like something you'd see at the entrance of a gated estate. I remember standing in my yard that first afternoon, just watching them work, wiping my hands on a rag, thinking, this seems like overkill. A few days later, the cedar panels went in. Thick, rich wood, stained a deep brown that almost glowed in the sunlight. Between the panels, black iron brackets tied everything together, giving it this solid, permanent feel, like it wasn't just a fence, it was a statement. Privacy, control, ownership, that's what it said. And the strange thing was, the more it went up, the more it felt like it was leaning toward me. Not literally, of course. Everything was straight, level, professionally done. But visually, it felt closer than it should have been. Closer to my workshop. Closer to the path I used to walk along the edge of my yard. At first, I brushed it off. Probably just the height. I muttered to myself one evening, standing there with a cup of coffee, staring at those stone pillars. Makes it feel tighter than it is. But the thought didn't go away. It lingered, quiet, persistent, like a splinter you can't quite see, but you know is there. A couple days later, I mentioned it to my buddy Carl over a beer. "You ever notice anything weird about that new fence?" I asked. Carl squinted toward the property line, took a sip, shrugged. "Looks expensive." "Yeah," I said. "That's not what I meant." He laughed. "You think he built it on your land or something?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth was that exact thought had already crossed my mind. And once it did, I couldn't unthink it. That night, I went digging through a drawer in my office where I keep all the paperwork from when I bought the place. Closing documents, tax records, and somewhere in there, the original survey. It took me about 20 minutes to find it, folded up inside a manila folder that hadn't been opened in years. I spread it out on the desk, smoothed the edges, and leaned in close. Lines, measurements, angles, it all came rushing back. The boundaries of the property were clearly marked, along with reference points, old metal pins driven into the ground decades ago to mark the corners. And according to that map, my property extended farther out than where that fence now stood. Not by inches, by several feet. I sat there for a long moment, just staring at it, feeling that slow, uncomfortable shift in my chest as curiosity turned into something else, something heavier. Because if that map was right, then that fence wasn't just close. It was wrong. And suddenly, this wasn't about aesthetics anymore. It was about ownership, about lines that weren't supposed to be crossed, but maybe already had been. I folded the paper back up, a little more carefully this time, and leaned back in my chair. All right, I said quietly to myself. Let's not jump to conclusions. But deep down, I already knew this wasn't going to be nothing. And the next step I took was the one that changed everything. The next morning, I called a surveyor. Not because I wanted trouble, and definitely not because I was looking for a fight. Truth is, I was still hoping I'd misunderstood something, that maybe the old map was off, or the landmarks had shifted over the years, something simple, something harmless. But there's a certain kind of doubt that doesn't go away on its own. It just sits there, quietly tapping at the back of your mind until you do something about it. So I did. The guy I hired was named Rick Dalton, not the movie star, though I joked about it when he picked up the phone. He didn't laugh much, but he sounded like someone who'd been doing this a long time, steady voice, no nonsense. I'll come take a look, he said. Shouldn't take more than a few hours if the pins are still there. The pins? I asked. Original boundary markers, he replied. Metal stakes, usually buried a few inches below ground. If they're intact, we'll know exactly where your line is. Exactly. That word stuck with me. We set it for early Friday morning. I figured getting it done before the weekend would give me time to think, maybe figure out how to approach Daniel if things weren't what I hoped. Friday came with that cool, quiet kind of morning you only get at the end of summer. I had coffee in hand when Rick pulled up, driving an older white truck with equipment stacked neatly in the back. He stepped out, gave me a quick nod, and got straight to work. No small talk, no assumptions, just measurements. He walked the perimeter slowly, methodically, setting up his tripod, peering through the scope, jotting numbers down on a clipboard. Every now and then, he'd pause, take a few steps back, adjust something, then continue. It was almost calming to watch, like someone restoring order to something invisible. At one point, he crouched near the corner of my yard, brushed away some dirt, and tapped something with his boot. Got one, he said. I walked over. There it was, a rusted metal pin, barely visible, buried just enough that you'd never notice it unless you were looking. That's your corner, Rick said. Been there a long time. We found 2 more over the next hour. Each one lined up perfectly with the measurements on my old survey, which meant the map was right. And the fence, well, by early afternoon, Rick had everything he needed. He stood there for a moment, looking down the length of that brand new fence, then glanced back at me. You want the short version, he said, or the detailed one? I already knew the answer, but I asked anyway. Short. He exhaled, shifted his weight slightly. That fence isn't on your boundary, he said. Not even close in some spots. How far off? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked back toward the line, squinting slightly. Varies, he said. But at the deepest point, looks like about 4 feet inside your property. 4 feet. It didn't sound like much when you said it out loud. But standing there, looking at that long stretch of stone and wood, realizing every inch of it sat on land that legally belonged to me, it felt different. He handed me a printed report along with a digital copy he'd emailed over. Then he did something that made it all very, very real. He pulled out a set of bright orange flags and started placing them along the actual boundary line, one by one, each flag a marker, not just of land, but of truth. And when he finished, the picture was impossible to ignore. The entire fence, columns, panels, everything sat clearly, undeniably, on my side. Rick packed up his gear, gave me a nod, and said, if this turns into a dispute, That report'll hold up in court." I thanked him, paid him, and watched as his truck disappeared down the road. Then I just stood there, alone, staring at those flags and that fence. And for the first time since this all started, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Just clarity. 2 days later, Daniel noticed. It was a Sunday afternoon. I was out by the workshop, sanding down a piece of old oak, trying to focus on something simple, something that made sense. That's when I heard footsteps on the gravel. "Hey," he called out. I looked up. He was standing near the fence, sunglasses on, hands in his pockets, that same confident posture. But there was something else now. Curiosity, maybe a hint of concern. "What's with the flags?" he asked, nodding toward the line of orange markers. I set the sander down, wiped my hands, and walked over slowly. "Had a survey done," I said. His expression tightened, just slightly. Yeah. I pulled the folded report from my back pocket and handed it to him. "Take a look." He hesitated for a second, then took it, scanning the pages quickly. At first, his face didn't change. Then it did. Subtle, but noticeable. His jaw shifted. His brow lowered just a bit. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "It does," I replied calmly. "If the measurements are right, and they are." He glanced back at the fence, then at the flags, then down at the paper again. "No," he said, shaking his head. "We measured this. My contractor walked the whole line." "With what?" I asked. He paused. "A stake," he said. "There was an old wooden marker here when we started. We used that as reference." I nodded slowly. "Yeah," I said. "That's the problem." He looked at me, irritation starting to creep in. "What do you mean?" "That stake wasn't official," I said. "The real markers are metal pins. Been in the ground for decades. We found them." I pointed toward one of the flag corners. "Line runs there, not here." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The wind picked up slightly, rustling through the trees, brushing against that brand new fence like it was trying to say something neither of us wanted to hear. Daniel exhaled sharply, ran a hand through his hair. "So what are you saying?" he asked. I held his gaze. "I'm saying your fence is on my land." That was the moment. The line in the sand, or in this case, the line in the dirt. And you could feel it. The shift from neighborly conversation to something else entirely. He let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Come on," he said. That can't be right. We spent weeks on this build. You're telling me nobody caught that?" "I'm telling you what the survey says," I replied, "and what the original documents say." He looked back at the fence again, really looked this time, and I could see it, the realization starting to settle in. Not fully, but enough. "That fence cost me a lot of money," he said, quieter now. "I can imagine," I said. Another pause. Then he looked at me again, and this time, there was something sharper behind his eyes. "So what, you want me to tear it down?" he asked. There it was. The question neither of us wanted to ask, but both knew was coming. I took a breath. "Legally," I said. "Yeah, that's one option." He scoffed, took a step back. "That's insane," he said. "You're talking about ripping out stone columns, custom panels, hauling everything out just because of a few feet?" "A few feet that belong to me," I said, still calm, but firmer now. His jaw tightened again. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Is it?" I asked. "Because from where I'm standing, someone built a structure on land they don't own." That hit. I could see it. And for a split second, just a second, I thought he might explode. But he didn't. Instead, he went quiet. Too quiet. "All right," he said finally. "Let me talk to my contractor. Maybe there's, I don't know, something we missed." "Sure," I said. "Take your time." He handed the report back, turned, and walked off without another word. And just like that, the conversation was over. But the problem? That was just getting started. Because over the next few days, things didn't cool down. They escalated. For a couple days, things went quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in that strange, tense way where you can feel something building, like pressure behind a wall. I'd see Daniel's truck come and go, but he didn't stop by again. No wave, no quick chat, nothing. The fence just stood there between us, solid, expensive, and suddenly, complicated. I kept busy, or at least I tried to. Spent more time in the workshop, started projects I didn't need, reorganized tools that were already organized. Anything to keep my mind from replaying that conversation over and over again. Because here's the thing, it wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about what came next. I'd never been in a situation like this before. I wasn't looking to make enemies, especially not with someone living 20 feet from me. But at the same time, this wasn't some minor misunderstanding you could just shrug off. It was property. Legal, documented, measured property. And every time I walked along that fence line, seeing those orange flags cutting a straight path through the grass, it reminded me of something simple and uncomfortable. That land was mine. On the third day, I heard voices. Not raised, but sharp enough to carry. I stepped outside and saw Daniel standing with another guy near the fence, mid-40s maybe, clipboard in hand, boots dusty, the kind of look that screamed contractor. They were going back and forth, low but intense. I'm telling you, the guy said, tapping the fence post. We followed the marker that was there. It was wrong, Daniel snapped. You based the entire build on a guess. It wasn't a guess, the contractor fired back. It was what we had. And now it's a problem, Daniel said. That's when they noticed me. Everything stopped. For a second, it felt like I'd walked into a scene I wasn't supposed to see. Then Daniel straightened up. Evan, he called, forcing something close to a polite tone. Got a minute? I walked over, slow, steady. The contractor gave me a quick nod, then stepped back slightly, like he knew this part wasn't his anymore. Daniel held up the survey report I'd given him. I had him take another look, he said. Check everything again. And? I asked. He exhaled. It lines up, he admitted. Your survey's correct. There it was. Out in the open. No more denial. No more confusion. Just the truth, sitting between us like that fence. The contractor shifted uncomfortably. Look, man, he said to me. If we'd known the pins were off from that stake, we would've. I know. I said, cutting him off gently. I get it. And I did. This wasn't some grand conspiracy. It was a mistake. A bad assumption that turned into an expensive problem. But mistakes don't erase consequences. Daniel rubbed his face, clearly frustrated. So where does that leave us? He asked. I leaned back slightly, crossing my arms, not defensive, just thinking. Well, I said, we've got a few options. Yeah, he said. Let's hear them. Option 1. I began. You remove the fence. Everything on my side comes out, and you rebuild it along the correct line. The contractor winced a little. Daniel didn't react, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. That's a lot, he said. I know, I replied. Option 2. You leave it, I said. But that means it stays on my property, which legally doesn't really work for either of us long term. He nodded slowly. No, it doesn't. There was a pause. A long one. Then I said, there is a third option. That got his attention. What's that? He asked. I looked out along the fence, those stone columns casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. You buy the strip, I said. He blinked. Buy it? Yeah, I said. The section of land where the fence sits. We adjust the boundary, make it official. The contractor raised his eyebrows slightly. Daniel just stared at me, processing. You'd sell it? He asked. I'd consider it, I said. If the terms make sense. Another silence. But this one felt different. Less like conflict, more like calculation. Daniel glanced back at the fence, then at the house, then at the ground between us. That might actually, he started, then stopped, thinking it through. It'd save you from tearing all this down, I added. And it keeps things clean legally. He let out a slow breath. All right, he said finally. Let me talk to a lawyer. See what that process looks like. Fair, I said. The contractor gave a small nod, like he was relieved there was a path forward that didn't involve demolition. And just like that, the tension shifted. Not gone, but redirected. Over the next couple weeks, things moved, carefully. Daniel got a real estate attorney involved. I did the same. There were emails, drafts, revised drafts, discussions about exact measurements, compensation, county filings, all the unglamorous stuff that turns a problem into a solution. At one point, sitting across from my attorney, she looked at me and said, You know, you could push harder on this. How so? I asked. Force removal, she said, or negotiate a higher price. You have leverage. I nodded. I know, I said. She studied me for a second. But, I leaned back, thinking about it. But I still have to live next to the guy, I said. That seemed to answer it. In the end, we reached an agreement. Daniel purchased the strip of land, a narrow slice, just enough to cover the full length of the fence and a small buffer beyond it. The price was fair, maybe even a little in my favor, but not unreasonable. We filed the paperwork with the county. New boundary lines were drawn, recorded, and made official. Just like that, the fence was no longer on my land. It belonged exactly where it stood. The orange flags came down. The metal pins stayed where they'd always been. But now, the line had shifted. And life, slowly, went back to normal. These days, if you drove past our properties, you'd probably never know any of this happened. The fence looks perfect. Straight, solid, almost elegant in a way that still feels slightly out of place in a neighborhood like ours. Daniel finished building his house. Modern, clean lines, big windows, the kind of place that looks like it belongs in a magazine. We're cordial. Not friends, but not enemies either. We nod, exchange the occasional morning, sometimes talk about the weather like nothing ever happened. But every now and then, I'll walk along that fence line, run my hand along one of those stone columns, and I'll remember how close it came, how easily something that was mine could have quietly become someone else's if I hadn't paid attention. And more than that, I think about the line itself. Because that's the thing about boundaries. They're supposed to be clear, fixed, certain. But in real life, they're not always that simple. Sometimes they're buried under dirt, forgotten over time. Sometimes they're based on assumptions or convenience or what someone wants to believe is true. And sometimes they get tested, not with arguments or lawsuits, but with choices. What you're willing to fight for, what you're willing to let go, and what it actually means to be right. So here's the question I keep coming back to. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have forced him to tear it all down, every last stone, every panel, just to prove a point? Or would you have taken the deal, adjusted the line, and let the fence stay? Because depending on how you look at it, I either protected what was mine, or I sold it, and I'm still not sure which one matters more. Let me know what you think. Would you have handled it differently, or the same? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you've ever had a situation like this with a neighbor, I'd really like to hear that too.